Hi, and welcome to the Intuitive Insights podcast series. I'm Nina Lockwood, the founder and chief exec of Intuitive Talent Solutions. We work with leading transport organisations in the UK and bring them together with a diverse and talented candidate network for interim and permanent roles. The people who know me know that I like to immerse myself in good conversation. And over the course of the podcast series, I will be joined by some exceptionally talented leaders from the UK transport sector to talk about their careers, the industry, leadership, challenges and opportunities, and much more besides. I do hope that you'll join me and that you'll be inspired by my fabulous guests and their intuitive insights. I'm delighted to welcome Leon Daniels to this episode of the Intuitive Insights podcast. Amongst many other roles, Leon is the president of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport and has been in the transport industry for a considerable length of time and has so many intriguing and interesting stories to share with us. I loved this episode and this conversation. I hope you do too. Leon Daniels, hello. It's an absolute joy to welcome you to the Intuitive Insights podcast. I'm going to give you your full title. So, President of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. I needed to get that out the way because I wasn't convinced I could get my teeth around it, but I've done it now. And I know from conversations that you and I have had that you do lots of other things as well, but that's the title that we're running with for today's podcast. And as I say, it's an absolute joy and a pleasure to welcome you to the podcast this morning.
Thank you, Nina. And you'll see that my background has an unashamed plug for my podcast, Lunch with Leon, which you can get on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast from. So thank you for that opportunity too.
You're very welcome, and all plugs are welcome because I am a big fan of podcasts. I've listened to your podcast. There's a number of other industry ones that I'm a keen listener to, and I think what I try to do with the Intuitive Insights podcast conversations is to have a peek behind the scenes in terms of people's career stories in the transport industry. And I know from the feedback that we get that people are educated, they're inspired, and I know they are with your podcast too. So the flags are flying and they're very welcome too. So I'm going to ask you to, in time-honoured fashion, this is what we've been doing for the last 4 years now on the podcast, is to share career stories. So people who've had very successful career stories and that success is still ongoing, to take us back right to the very beginning. Share with us why transport. How did you get into the transport industry? And then take us on a journey, Leon, please, from where you've been to the work that you're currently doing today. Share the story with us.
Thank you, Nina. Well, of course, you can pop off and have a cup of tea now because
we'll have a 3-course lunch. Never mind a cup of tea.
as indeed we did.
We did.
Well, so I know I was interested in transport at an early age because I have some coloured drawings I did when I was about 4, which show ships and planes and lorries and buses and cars, which I have framed because there was clearly a bit of a transport thing when I was small. I have a photograph of myself in a bus conductor's uniform as a small boy, which now I'm getting old, I don't mind showing to people at presentations and so on. But professionally, my first job was in what's now the Department for Transport. And my small claim to fame is that I was the first member of the bill team that became the Highways Act 1980. And given that I finished my full-time career at Transport for London, it's convenient to think of it as a bookend of public service with a big bit in the middle in the private sector. So I did the Highways Act 1980. We did all that work, I have to say, before you think I'm younger than I am. We did all that work in the late 70s. It just didn't get onto the statute book until 1980. And that was a really exciting thing for a young person to be doing in the box when it was going through the House of Commons, advising the ministers and so on, and dealing with all the multiple amendments and things that you get, including a delicious thing. It was Section 135 of the Highways Act 1980, which gave the Secretary of State powers to lop down trees in the West Country, and it goes back to before the roads were made of tarmac. So the minister was allowed to cut down trees to allow the mud on the road to dry.
Oh
so
my
that it's
goodness, right.
a provision that nobody wanted, and they wanted it so little that they left it out of the Local Government Act 1972, which meant that it referred to the old counties. So as you drove across the old Somerset border, never mind the fact that Avon was created in the 1972 Local Government Act, as you went over the old borders of Devon, Cornwall, Somerset, etc., you had powers to lop down trees you didn't want. And I thought, this is interesting. It appeals to my sense of the bizarre, but I'm not entirely sure I want to spend all of my life piloting through useless provisions in legislation. And just to tell you, and to all of your viewers and listeners, how all this stuff comes back full circle. As you know, I'm currently chair of the Highway Sector Council, which is a public-private partnership with the Department for Transport, National Highways, and all the private sector constructors and all the other stakeholders are involved in highways. And what's our term of reference? It's the Highways Act 1980. So
oh my goodness. Right back to where you started.
There you go, right back where I started. After I did that, I was in shipping. And after I was in shipping, I was in publishing. And that's where the story really starts for me, how I was dragged through the hedge into transport by mistake, because I worked for a man called Prince Marshall. That was his name. And Prince was a publisher, ran some titles, including Old Motor Magazine, and he was a very serious vintage vehicle expert. And he had come back from the USA, which was to see how vintage vehicle restoration is done in America. And that's not like we do on a Sunday, where you spend all day with a piece of sandpaper trying to improve things more than the weather had spoiled them over the last week. Yeah. You get, in the US, you get commercial sponsorship, and you get the thing done properly and quickly and pay for it out of the sponsorship. And that's what happened with Prince. We ended up with Johnny Walker sponsoring a 1930s double-decker bus. It's called ST922, now lives in the London Bus Museum at Brooklands. Right. I'm also chair. And that bus started service in London as a tourist attraction long before Margaret Thatcher thought of privatisation or deregulation or was even in government. In fact, much to the amazement of the Transport and General Workers Union, we ended up running lots of buses in London. We ran modern buses on the sightseeing tour, vintage buses. We did loads of film and TV work. And that might well have carried on if Prince hadn't sadly died prematurely in his 40s. So I then started London Pride sightseeing with some help from some good friends. And my idea was not to restore vintage vehicles. My idea was to have mobile 48 sheet posters running around London. So I ran sightseeing tours for the benefit of the advertising. That was where the money was, although we also carried passengers. And you will know there are no 48 sheet posters in London. So a painted advertising bus is the nearest thing that you get. And I had Marks and Spencer's and Burger King and Trocadero and Barclaycard and all these wonderful blue chip clients. In due course, that business became quite big. We sold it. In fact, it was sold several times. It first went into Ensign Bus at Purfleet. And in fact, London Pride sightseeing stayed there a very long time. It is now, you can trace it right the way back to London Pride. It's now What's Toot Bus in London, owned by RATP Dev UK. Well, I'm also the chairman. So when all this stuff comes back to haunt you decades after you did something with it. So in Ensign Bus, that's when tendering in London first started. We won our first few London Bus contracts, and in due course we were spun out of that. So London Pride sightseeing stayed behind, and the London regional transport contracts moved, and our new ownership was CNT Holdings in Hong Kong, which also owned Citybus in Hong Kong and Rediffusion in Hong Kong and China Paint in Hong Kong and so on. And that was part of a roving diplomatic mission by the Chinese government to improve relationships with the West after Tiananmen Square.
Right.
Who would have thought I would have been involved in Sino-British politics in the early 1990s, when relations with the West were restored? They didn't need the company anymore, so my management team and I bought it. Thank you, NatWest and Lloyd's Development Capital. You had the biggest share, we didn't. And we ran that business for several years and grew it and sold it into First Group. I went with it into First Group. People like me, when they're bought out by big groups, tend to stay 6 weeks, 7 if you're lucky. In fact, I stayed 13 years. And that's mostly because our chief executive, then Sir Moy Lockhead, put me in charge of anything but the business I had sold into them. And so I had assignments in the US and in Europe and in UK. I was commercial director of bus for some at that time. And I might have even still been there if the chance to go to Transport for London as managing director Surface Transport hadn't come up in 2010, and the chance to go to TfL and be in charge of all the surface transport in London in the run up to and during the Olympic Games, and subsequently just couldn't be missed. So that's what I did. There'll be a much longer version of that story in my book. 1 or 2 more people will have to be deceased before I can actually write it. But that brings me through to TfL, and then I left TfL. Not the sort of job you can do for a long time. I was the longest serving managing director of surface transport, but senior public sector roles are very taxing in terms of 24-hour, 7-day a week, non-stop on duty, major security incidents that happened in my time. And so it's the sort of job you shouldn't get hooked on the adrenaline for too long. And I was able to step out. And now I just do a few nice things for a few nice people, which is a brilliant way to spend your retirement.
Amazing. Yeah. I am, and I was when you shared the longer version with me a few months ago, I'm blown away by the number of roles that you've had across your career and the really significant roles. So in terms of how the transport industry has evolved over that time, being in really significant roles, and also working with characters that we all think we know because we see them on the telly, perhaps, as senior politicians, etc., on the London scene, for example. And these are people that you've just you worked with, and as you say, 24/7, full on. But what an amazing part of your career that must have been, in terms of learning about human behaviour, Leon, as much as anything else.
Indeed. Well, there's no doubt in transport you see every bit of human behaviour from the very top to the very bottom. I was very lucky across the wider issue. Timing is everything. I happened to be in the right place in the early 1980s, when what we used to call excursions and tours were deregulated. So my sightseeing business couldn't have worked a few years previously, but after that 1980 Act, it could. In fact, the legislation was so badly written, there were no powers to turn you down. So even if you asked to do the most outrageous thing, there were no powers to refuse you, which was extraordinary. So I was lucky with the sightseeing. I was lucky to catch the beginning of tendering for contracted bus services in London, which started in 1985. I was lucky to catch the Chinese diplomatic mission to restore relations with the West, which meant I found myself with both John Major and Michael Heseltine, who were seriously involved at the time. I was lucky, therefore, to exit to First Group and to be in First Group as they made their first moves into rail, into America, when they first bought Ryder, to acquire Greyhound as part of Laidlaw. And then I was very lucky to land in TfL just over a year before the only Olympic Games of my lifetime, because I wasn't around in 1948. Even I wasn't around in 1948. And I won't be around for the next one. So to catch then the Olympics and to be working on a daily basis. So Jeremy Hunt was Secretary of State at DCMS at the time. So great person to work with. Of course, I was working daily with Boris while he was Mayor of London, and then subsequently with Sadiq Khan. And the whole group of politicians, all of whom have written books, none of which refer to me. And to work with these people on a daily basis was tremendous. And of course, also with members of the royal family. Prince Michael of Kent, what an extraordinary supporter of transport in all its senses. Always wanted to come to our control room in TfL and learn about what we were doing, and so on. So I'm really lucky to work with some people that we also see on the television.
Yeah.
But also the people in the transport industry. So I've never been worried about having clever people working for me. I think a good manager, a good leader, gets the very best people. I've never worried about being eclipsed by people far cleverer than me, because actually, if they're very clever and very successful, they make me look good. So
Exactly.
I've never had any worry about that. So I'd also really just like to talk and sort of pay tribute to some of the brilliant people I've had working for me over the years. If I've had any success at all, it's thanks to their hard work. And they didn't just come to me with problems, they came with solutions. They had huge skills. And I'd like to say that, and a couple of times in my career, and certainly at TfL, I was working with some of the cleverest and most powerful management teams that I can ever remember. And although I slightly struggle sometimes because they were so brilliant and I was trying to understand it, we were all part of a team. And a great thing about a team is you have like Genghis Khan at one end of the scale, and you have the thinkers and the blue sky strategists at the other end. You get them in the right proportion in a room and overcome the fact we're all speaking a different language. Once we get past all that, that's the ingredient of powerful team. So a real tribute to all the people that I worked with, because so many of them were brilliant, and indeed many of them have gone on to do even better things now, for which I'm really proud.
So there's a few things in there that I'd like to kind of ask you to develop, and there always is, and it's kind of like trying to keep this into a tight time scale is going to be really challenging for me, because there's so many things I want to ask you. When you say you were lucky, and I was lucky to be here, and I was lucky to be there, and I was lucky to be there, and I just happened to be in the right place. I remember having a similar conversation with Andy Lord, who, of course, is the Transport Commissioner at TfL these days. And Andy used this same expression, I've been lucky through my career. And I'm absolutely very happy to accept that luck plays a part. But there must be something about you, Leon, that means that people are prepared to give you the opportunity, because you've done some really big stuff through your career. So as I said, I'm prepared to give you a little bit of, yes, that was luck, and yes, right place, right time. But you have to be able to spot the opportunity. So lots of people can be in the right place at the right time, but they don't know they were. So the opportunity comes and goes. But what was it about you, do you think, that other people spotted that said, yeah, we think that these are a safe pair of hands and a good head on a pair of shoulders to take us through this huge piece of work that needs to be done?
Well, it's hard for me to judge that. Almost anybody else would be a better person to ask than me. But I'm going to answer it, I think, with best way to do it is with a story. And I think if you have to be something to be successful, you have to be genuine and you have to be authentic, and people have to trust you. I certainly spent a whole lot of time, if you like, making the industry my life. So I spent lots of time at events and socializing and so on. And early on in my career, when frankly we'd won some bus contracts and my balance sheet wouldn't possibly stand what we needed. I needed a significant number of double-decker buses, and Sandy Glennie, who was the top man for Volvo in the UK, which in those days also owned Leyland, he said, if you give me the order, I will fund it for you. And I know he went to the Volvo credit committee in Sweden and personally vouched for me. Well, there's good news for all of us. I got my buses.
Yeah.
We paid the monthly rental on those buses every month on the nail. When they got absorbed into First Group, who renewed them for a second term and a third term.
Yeah.
The Volvo got their money back 5 times over. And there's a case where somebody very much more senior than me, in charge of a multi-million pound business, personally vouched for me because he trusted me. Now, the days of personal trust count for less nowadays. Nowadays, you've got to be smarter than that. But in the time we're talking about, back in 1990. So I think it's about being authentic, and I think it's about being trusted. I think it is about not appearing, as can be the case in business, where if you get half a chance, you'll stitch up your competitor or colleague or whatever. So I think it's about being authentic.
Yeah.
And I'd like to think, of course, only I can tell that story, but I'd like to think that's what people outside would say.
Yes. Do you know what? I completely agree with you. For me, it's kind of doing the right thing and doing it for the right reasons. And people know that when you say you're going to do it, that you'll do it. And one of the things, and we've only known each other a short amount of time, but that kind of the authenticity of sitting and having a conversation with someone who is very much what you see is what you get, but feeling like the authenticity is there, which means that you build trust very quickly because I feel like I'm getting the real deal.
Yeah, and there is something in that, because so much of things nowadays are effectively scored. You know, there's a credit rating and there's a risk rating and there's this, that, and the other. So much of it is scored. But I hope we never lose sight of the personal relationship, because if you and I are friends as well as in business, and one of us is a supplier and one of us is a customer, I don't want to let my friend down.
Yeah.
And you don't want to let your friend down.
Exactly.
As I say, although business is rather transparently scoring led nowadays, and for all sorts of good reasons, there's a lot in not letting your friends down.
Yes, absolutely agree. The relationship part, and for me, to be fair, that's where the pleasure of going to work comes from, is because you've built relationships with people where you care. You know, I care what happens with your business, and if can I help in any way, and that whole how it all works.
And actually, your issues are my issues.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
if you go out of business, who's going to support me?
Exactly. I think there may be some similarities between your answer to that question and to the question that I'm about to ask you, which is around about your leadership of a team. And you've absolutely acknowledged that kind of having the right people in the team and a diverse mix of people, from, you know, kind of one end of the Genghis Khan example right through to the blue sky thinkers and everything in between. So a diverse team all working together. How would you describe your leadership style, Leon, to get the best out of that team? Or actually, how would your team describe your leadership style?
Yeah, my team would describe my leadership style as absent.
Okay, so definitely not a micromanager then.
No,
Get on with it.
I guess this is a terrible generalization. I would often give my teams ideas and thoughts and send them off to think about it. I would often receive ideas and thoughts from other people, and that's why being a prolific, in my day we didn't really have social media, but you learn so much from seeing and learning what other people do. In my day, we went to exhibitions and conferences and so on. Nowadays, it's on YouTube. But also, my team would effectively often come up with proposals and thoughts, and my job was to sell it. And I was selling it to whoever needed to approve it. I was selling it to the Mayor of London. I was selling it to wherever we had to sell it to. So I thought of myself as the outward facing exponent of whatever organization I was in was trying to do. So I'd like to think that my teams would say, when I wasn't absent, that my teams would say, he gave us the space to develop things. He gave us some ideas, some of which were bonkers. And we made some things out of it. And when we'd made it in any way sort of digestible, he would then take it and sell it wherever it needed to be sold. That didn't always work, of course.
Yeah.
And there were certainly plenty of plans that never went anywhere. But you only, as any entrepreneur will tell you, you only have to be successful 1 in every 10 times for it to matter.
Yeah.
So, and in terms of leadership style, always remembering not to have a group of people and say, this is what I think, what about you? Because if you do that, they'll just tell you back what you told them. So keeping your mouth shut and listening to what they had to say. Sometimes having to arbitrate between really competing views and opinions.
Yeah.
I'd like to think my teams would say that they had a good hearing, and even if they didn't get their own way, at least they knew why.
Yes. Yeah. So being able to listen to people is key, isn't it, as a leader? Definitely, hearing that in what you've just said to me. And also hearing that you gave people freedom to be creative and to be innovative, which doesn't always happen either. So that kind of leaving them, here's the what we're working with. Tell me, I'll start you off with an idea, but tell me your ideas, and then we'll get to a point where it's ready for me to go and share that with relevant parties.
And just before we leave that point, that all being said, and this is specific to transport, whilst you give your teams freedom to think and talk and strategize and all the rest of it, you mustn't ever lose sight of the fact you've only got the space to do that if this morning's peak hour was any good. Because if there's not a rigorous attention to detail in transport, punctuality, reliability, cleanliness, of course, if you don't have that, you haven't really got the time to go off and be very creative. And in fact, Peter Hendy, Lord Hendy, now of Richmond Hill, that was his chief watchword in TfL when he was commissioner. How was this morning's peak? What have you done to make sure it's better tomorrow? And if this morning's peak hour was no good at all, then you haven't got time to go off and be creative.
No.
So that rigorous attention to detail, and if you look through the history of Transport for London in its period, and under Peter's guidance, because he was commissioner for 10 years, it was that rigorous attention to detail that gently every day got us a better bus service, a better underground service. It got us more reliability. It got us huge improvements in safety. So just before anybody thinks that this career is all about people having blue sky thinking in locked rooms, beanbags. That's what I
was just about to say, beanbags. Yeah, that's the image that came in my head.
That rigorous attention to detail is very important.
Yeah. So having the basics right, because they are the basics, aren't they? All of the things that you listed there about performance and cleanliness, etc., they are the basics. But if they're not right, then there's almost no point in the rest of it, is there?
No, indeed. And the other baptism of fire I had, and this goes back to first group. So in the immediate aftermath of the Ladbroke Grove train crash, I think in 1999, Sir Moir Lockhead completely drove a new safety culture through the organisation. That's first group. And although it's pretty common now, this is 25 years ago, And he drove a safety culture through the organization. And we all, one form or another, thought that some of this was just impossible.
Right.
You know, simple things, we're talking 25 years ago, like not being able to use your mobile phone in your car. I don't mean in your hand. I mean not being able to use it at all.
Yeah.
And we all said things like, "Oh, you sent the van out to a breakdown that's 40 minutes away, and you can't phone the driver to bring them back because it's been fixed. What a waste!" And all those sorts of thoughts.
Yes.
Actually, he was dead right,
Yeah.
because what he'd spotted was that, as we now know, because it's properly taught now, but you accidentally erode the safety margin bit by bit by bit. And although you think you've got this much margin, you in fact only got that much because you've eroded the rest away.
Yeah.
I know it worked because as I came out of our offices, which were on platform 1 at Paddington Station, a small young lady from finance was walking out of the door and saw a big train driver, like about 18 stone worth of male train driver,
Yeah.
jump out of the cab of a high-speed train on platform 1 at Paddington. And she marched over to him and said, "Hello, I also work for First Group. Would you mind explaining to me how you think that's safe?" Now, that tells you something about a safety culture.
It really does.
An administrative person, a more junior person,
Mm.
speaking to a much older, more, let's say, brutal.
Yes, like physically much. Yeah.
Would you mind telling me why you think that was safe?
Yeah.
And that got, and don't go, it was well received. It was a great experience, and I just witnessed it. And I would just like, the safety culture we have now about reporting, self-reporting, and even the safe way to climb the stairs
Yes.
has its origins in what Moya did after
Mm.
as I say, commonplace now. But
Yeah.
I promise you, 25 years ago, it wasn't.
No. This is fascinating, and as I'm struggling to keep on to time, Leon,
Sorry,
because there's so much more. No, it's not
most
you,
of it'll be
it's
in the
me,
book.
because I've got more I want to ask you about that.
Yes.
But I'm going to move on to the middle section of our conversation, which, bearing in mind all of the jobs that you've done, all the roles you've undertaken, and the seniority of those, and what you've seen other people doing throughout the years, and goodness knows how many transport secretaries and chief execs, etc., that you've had exposure to in that time. If I was to get my magic wand out and grant you 3 wishes for what you would like to see changed in the UK transport industry to make us fit for the future, what would those 3 wishes be?
Sure. What transport in this country desperately needs is a very long-term investment plan from the government. So this 1-year rollover stuff won't do. What we really need for highways, for railways, what we need is a drumbeat of investment that is guaranteed and inflation proofed every year for a decade.
Yeah.
We don't have to know what we're going to spend it all on immediately, and especially downstream. But if we know what the funding for highways is likely to be like, or funding for railways is likely to be like, then that unlocks the door for investment. It unlocks the door for training, unlocks the door for apprentices, skills, technical innovation, and so on.
Yeah.
So I know I'm asking a lot here, but what we have are fits and starts of investments and stopping and starting and stopping. It's no secret in London at the moment, there isn't now a major infrastructure program that's funded. And there's all sorts of things we need to do, including the signals on the Piccadilly line and Crossrail 2 and extending the Elizabeth line and all the things, but none of it's funded. They're wiggly lines on a map. So what we desperately need is long-term funding guarantees. They haven't got to be accurate. They do need to be inflation proofed, and we need to have that. So we've got the long-term plan, so the government knows how much it's up for, and the appropriate business cases will still have to be developed and still have to get approved. Nobody's Nobody's skirting around that. But these transport projects take a very long time, and that's desperate. That's desperately what we needed. My second magic wand moment is we've made fantastic progress on diversity and inclusion, but the composition of our workforce at all levels ought to reflect the composition of our passengers. And on buses, it's not a surprise that the majority of our passengers are women. That ought to be reflected in our workforce and in the boardroom. And the same goes for all forms of diversity and so on. So we can't hope to succeed if we don't accurately reflect the people that pay for all this stuff. And I'd rather we did that. And then my final one, which I have to say is a bit of a pipe dream now, because of the direction of travel that we're going into in this country, with the general election coming down on us. Perhaps we've even had one by the time you broadcast this, but assuming we haven't, we're moving into a phase of more state control and greater government involvement. My magic wand would be that the transport industry, without being in any way political, learns all the lessons and embraces the culture that we enjoy from retail. And I use this as an example of all the campaigns to renationalize and re-regulate buses, water, energy. Nobody in the world is suggesting we do that to British Airways. So British Airways was a government-owned organisation, lost millions of pounds, gave a crummy service, and flew to the Commonwealth because that's what the government thought it ought to do. It was privatised. And guess what? It's now profitable. It flies to the places where people want to go at a price that they can afford to pay, or certainly enough of them to pay. Nobody's suggesting that British Airways should go back into public ownership and be fully regulated by the government. And why is that? Because it's a retailer. Right. And it goes to places where people want to go, and it charges what it can charge. And let's just think about bus, and to some extent rail, only half stepped out of being a utility, and only half became a retailer. And, you know, the retail end of it was quite good, you know, jazzy colour schemes and smart advertising and chasing for revenue and so on. I do think that transport missed a trick, because the public very clearly, as is the case with energy and water, wants its transport back. Somehow this increased government control will change the laws of economics, and somehow the water will flow uphill instead of downhill. The answer to all of our problems in transport is income. Income comes from ridership. Ridership comes from being a good retailer. And we're all, you know, we all experience good retail, don't we? Whether we're in Waitrose or Amazon or whatever it is we're doing, we experience good retail, cleanliness, staff who know what they're talking about, good signage, value for money, instant money back guarantees, all that sort of stuff. Yeah. So my third wish, Nina, is that whilst I have no doubt we're going to go into a period of greater government control, we try and make transport as good a retailer as the best retailers that we know.
Yes, that's such a good point. Such a good point. And so much we can learn from that industry in terms of how we go about what we do. And I think it's one of the things that I'm constantly kind of coming back to in so many of the conversations I'm having, is that we tend to talk a lot about the infrastructure and the ways, like the buses and the trains, and probably the rail industry's more guilty of that than the bus industry, to be fair. But ultimately, it's about the people. It's about the people who are running the service and the people who are using the service. And there's so much that we can learn from the retail sector in terms of that, in relation to how do we get that right. Really good point. Really good point. Thank you so much for sharing your three wishes. So I am really envious of your ability to be able to remember all of these facts and figures, all of this information throughout a very long career. And so your energy is something which really just stands out for me in every conversation that we've had. So I don't imagine that these days come often, but when there is perhaps a day every year where you wake up and you think, right, not really up for this today. Where do you get your inspiration from, your energy from, your motivation from? What fills your cup up, Leon?
Well, firstly, I read a lot and I do a lot of traveling. So I make good use of my traveling and I read a lot. If you could see my bookcase, you'd see every political biography going back to
Right.
well, Churchill, probably. And so I read tons of stuff. And the great thing now, electronically, you can have it on your iPad as well as carrying the books about.
Yeah.
And I get great motivation from all of that. Secondly, I am fascinated by the future. And you might say, well, that's because you've got less of it to look forward to than the rest of us. So I'm fascinated by the future. So I am absolutely wedded to all the exciting stuff that's going on, things that allow us to make this podcast,
Mm.
the things that allow us to make our own YouTube videos, um, our way to communicate with each other. And every day I'm teaching myself something new that I can do with my GoPro, or something new
Yeah.
I can do
Yeah.
with sound devices and software and so on. So I'm always fascinated about the future. And that's why some of the things I do, I've been working in autonomous vehicles. I've been working in modern forms of traffic management here in retirement. And I'm fascinated about the future. So the fact the future is so exciting for me, I
Mm.
think gives me the energy to get involved in all of that.
Yeah.
And so, but otherwise, I really can't answer it because the only point of reference I have is me. So
Yeah. Yeah.
all I know is I wake up every morning, as Boris would say, and jump out of bed like a scalded rabbit. That's his quote, not mine. Um,
I'm sure you've got a few cracking quotes of Boris's,
I-
Leon, but we'll have to wait for the book for that.
I'm afraid you'll definitely have to wait for the book for most, if not certainly not all of those. Uh, And um, and uh, so in terms of energy, I plan to carry on doing this. I'm super busy in retirement, as you know,
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
acting as an advisor or director for a range of organizations here and overseas. I love my travel. My friends do this, oh, I see you're in the UK again, um, thing, because I absolutely love my travel. Somebody once said a long time ago, travel broadens the mind. Oh, it does more than that. Travel is exciting. And I'm excited from the moment of leaving home to the airport, to the journey, to the destination. And the
Yeah.
fact that I recently got marooned in San Francisco at midnight with my bags in Dallas, and nowhere to stay, I just think is fantastic. The fact
Okay.
here
Right.
I, here I am stood in the street in San Francisco, nowhere to stay. It's midnight, and all I have is what I've got with me. That's amazing. So,
Okay.
so
I,
uh,
I can't relate to that one necessarily, but I do. I'm with you on the reading. I'm an avid reader, and next time you and I speak, I'd like some recommendations for what should be on my bookshelf. And I'm definitely the traveling side. I completely agree with too. But Midnight on the Pavement in San Francisco, you can keep that one.
that was
But I
that was,
think that
and I'm not going to name check Qantas here, but uh, but but uh, again, and I mentioned it because we're all in this transport business together. We're
yeah,
all consumers as well as providers, and therefore we have to think very carefully of it. Amongst my favourite assignments, because I'm also chair of Thames Clippers here on the River
right,
Thames.
right,
What a fantastic opportunity that is to get more people to use the River Thames.
yes,
We've got
agree.
really good passenger growth. We've got our first hybrid boats for the first time, so we're running on battery power between Tower Bridge and Battersea,
Mm.
which is just amazing. And I never thought in my life I would ever be doing anything with passenger boats, but
No,
Here it is. So for everybody in transport, I would just say don't have your horizons too narrow. Don't be too frightened about stepping out of your specialism and going into another part of transport, whether it's freight and logistics, whether it's boats, whether it's flying to the moon, whatever it is, because the lessons are similar. The experience is hugely valuable, and certainly on anybody's CV, if you come back into passenger transport, for example, having done freight and logistics, aviation, and a bit of shipping,
Yes.
you'll be head and shoulders above the other candidates. So my recommendation is don't be afraid to cast your net very widely.
Yeah, don't limit yourself. And I think there's a phrase. So we have on my wall up here, we have the intuitive, what we call the brand wheel. We did some work 3 years ago with a really good friend of mine and very clever lady, Claire. And she built this brand wheel after a number of workshops with me and my team. Who are we as a brand, as a business? Who are we? What do we stand for? What's our personality? And one of the things that's written on here, which I think I can apply really well to you, is infinitely curious. And that's kind of wanting to know, what's that about? How does it work? How can it work better? And what do you do? And how does that impact? So it's this kind of questioning mind, inquiring mind, where you are infinitely curious. I find you so interesting to have a conversation with. I could quite honestly sit here for hours. And we had the benefit of a very long lunch, didn't we, back in
We
November?
did. Like such a long lunch, it nearly merged into your evening engagement.
So I would love to do that again. But in the meantime, for this conversation today, I'm going to say a huge thank you to you, Leon Daniels, for joining me on the Intuitive Insights podcast. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. I know that our audience will take a lot from it too. So a big thank you from me to you.
Nina, great pleasure and lovely to talk to you again.
Thank you. My huge thanks to Leon Daniels for joining me on the Intuitive Insights podcast, and to you for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please do like and subscribe to the podcast and share it with your network if you think it's going to be something of interest to them. I really appreciate your support as always, and please do join me for the next one.